I want to start this off by saying that I am not someone who scares easily. I've always been that person in a group who rolls their eyes at ghost stories. The one who says it was probably nothing. The skeptic. So when I tell you that what happened to me on a Tuesday night in late November changed the way I move through the world permanently, I want you to understand that I don't say that lightly. At the time, I was 26 years old and living alone in a mid-sized city. Not a dangerous city by any stretch. Average crime, average neighborhoods. I had a small apartment on the third floor of an older building, and I'd been living there for almost 2 years without a single problem. I worked as a graphic designer for a marketing company, which meant I kept weird hours. Some nights I left the office at 5. Other nights, like that Tuesday, I didn't leave until close to 10:30 at night. The walk from my office to my apartment was about 12 minutes on foot. I'd made that walk dozens of times at night and never once felt uneasy. It took me through a main commercial street for the first half, and then through a quieter residential stretch for the second half. Decent lighting the whole way. Nothing alarming. That night, I remember stepping out of the building and immediately feeling the cold. It had dropped hard that week. The kind of cold that makes the world feel still and empty. The streets were quiet. A few cars passing. A restaurant still open with warm light spilling onto the sidewalk. Normal stuff. I had my headphones in, listening to a podcast. I was tired, a little hungry, mostly just thinking about getting home and eating something. I wasn't paying close attention to anything around me. I was about 3 minutes into my walk when I took one headphone out to hear a traffic light better before crossing. And that's when I noticed him. A man, maybe 40 feet behind me. He was wearing a tan jacket, dark pants. Average height, average build. Nothing unusual about him at all. He was just a man walking down the street at night. There was nothing at all alarming about that in the moment. But as I crossed the street and continued walking, I found myself glancing back once, then twice. And each time I did, he was still there. Same distance, same pace, same direction. I told myself I was being paranoid. I turned onto the residential stretch, the quieter half of my walk. Fewer businesses, fewer people, and the lighting was noticeably dimmer. I walked a little faster without fully realizing I was doing it. Just a slight, unconscious acceleration. And as I turned another corner, I glanced back one more time. He was still there. Still the same distance behind me, which meant he had also sped up to match me without closing the gap. And somehow that was more unsettling than if he had simply been walking faster than me. He wasn't trying to pass me. He wasn't falling behind. He was keeping pace, deliberately maintaining that exact same 40 feet of space between us. My heart started going faster. I made a decision in that moment, a small test. I know some of you have probably heard the advice before. Pick a random door, a random house or building, and stop there like you belong, like you're about to knock or go inside. If the person behind you keeps walking, they were never following you in the first place. If they stop or slow down, then you have your answer. I walked up to the nearest house, took out my keys like I was about to unlock the door, and stopped. I pretended to be searching for the right key. I counted to 15 slowly in my head while keeping my peripheral vision on the sidewalk behind me. He stopped. He didn't slow down and stop right behind me. He was smarter than that. He stopped maybe 20 feet back, pulled out his phone, and stood there like he was reading something, like he was waiting for a text. Natural looking, casual, but he stopped the exact moment I stopped. The cold I was already feeling turned into something else entirely. I didn't wait. I didn't overthink. I had my phone out in seconds, and I called my friend Dana, who lived about 8 blocks away from me in a completely different direction than my apartment. I told her I was coming over and I needed her to stay on the phone with me. She picked up immediately, and to her enormous credit, she didn't ask questions. She just started talking to me, like we were just catching up. Normally, I walked quickly, phone to my ear. I took 2 turns away from my apartment, heading toward Dana's place. And every 30 seconds or so, I'd make a point of looking into a store window instead of turning around. Store windows work like mirrors, and watching the reflection of the street behind me. He was still following me. He stayed with me through both turns. This was no longer a coincidence. This was no longer me being paranoid. This man was following me, deliberately, through a city at 10:30 at night. And the way he was doing it, maintaining that distance, never getting too close, stopping when I stopped, told me he had done this before. It didn't feel clumsy or opportunistic. It felt practiced. I told Dana quietly what was happening. She told me to keep walking, and she'd meet me halfway. That she was already putting her shoes on. I was now about 4 blocks from her place when I passed a late-night pharmacy that was still open and fully lit. I made the split-second decision and walked straight inside. The fluorescent lights were almost blinding after the dark street. A bored employee looked up from behind the register. I walked to the back of the store, heart hammering, and turned around to look at the front entrance. He didn't come in. I stood in that pharmacy for 11 minutes. I know because I was watching the clock above the register the entire time. I bought a bottle of water I didn't need just to have a reason to be there. And when Dana arrived and walked in to get me, we left together through the front door and walked back to her place with my hand wrapped around my phone the entire way. He was gone by then. He never came in. He never approached me. And I never saw him again after leaving that pharmacy. Dana stayed up with me until almost 2 in the morning and then drove me home herself. I filed a report with the non-emergency police line the next day. Described him as best I could. Nothing ever came of it. But here's the thing that I still think about more than any other part of what happened that night. And it's the part that keeps this from just being a story about a close call. My apartment was in the other direction. I had turned away from it entirely when I went toward Dana's place, which means that man had no idea where I lived. But if I had just walked home like I did every single other night, he would have. 3 weeks. I need to tell you up front that by the time I realized what was actually going on, it had already been happening for 3 weeks. That is the part that is the hardest to sit with. Not the night it finally came to a head. Not the moment I finally understood, but the weeks before that, going about my life completely unaware that I was already being watched. I was 31 when this happened. I had recently gone through a divorce and moved to a new city for a fresh start. I didn't know many people there yet. I was rebuilding from scratch. I had a new apartment, a new job at a small law firm as a paralegal, and I was slowly, carefully, trying to put a new life together. I had developed a habit of going for evening walks after dinner. Not late, usually between 8 and 9, just to clear my head after long days and get some air. I took the same route every night because I was still new to the city and hadn't fully explored yet. Down my street, left on Callaway, through the small park on the corner of 4th and Meridian, and then looping back around. About 35 minutes total. The park was quiet at that hour. Mostly empty. A few dog walkers, occasionally a couple on a bench. Lit well enough along the main path that I never felt unsafe there. For the first few weeks, the walks were genuinely peaceful. Exactly what I needed. And then I started noticing the man on the bench. He was always on the same bench. The one near the east entrance of the park. Just sitting there. Not on his phone, not reading, not waiting for anyone as far as I could tell. Just sitting. He was older, late 50s, maybe early 60s. Gray hair, a dark coat, glasses. The first time I noticed him, I didn't think anything of it. Some people just like to sit in parks at night. Fine. The second time, I remember thinking it was a little unusual, but still not alarming. By the 5th or 6th time I passed him on that bench, a small, quiet part of my brain filed it away as strange. But I overrode it. I told myself I was being unfair, that I was projecting anxiety from everything else going on in my life onto a harmless old man who just happened to like sitting outside at night. And then one evening about 3 weeks into my routine, I finished work late and skipped my walk entirely. I ordered food, watched TV, and went to bed early. The next night when I walked through the park, he wasn't on the bench. And I felt relieved. In that specific, distinct way that you feel relieved when something you'd been pretending not to worry about is suddenly gone. My own relief alarmed me more than his presence had. I walked home and spent the next hour sitting at my kitchen table thinking. Really thinking. He was always there when I walked through. Always on the same bench. Always alone. Always just watching the path. And on the one evening I didn't go, he wasn't there either. I opened the notes app on my phone and started writing down everything I could remember. The dates I'd seen him, what he was wearing each time, whether he'd looked at me directly, whether he'd ever spoken to me, trying to lay it all out clearly. He had looked at me, every single time, but in a way that could always be explained away. It's natural to look at people walking past you. He'd never spoken, never stood up, never followed me through the park that I was aware of. But the bench was positioned in a very specific way, facing the path, facing the entrance, facing the exact route that I took every single night. I made a decision to change my route the next evening and watch carefully. I came into the park from the west entrance instead of the east. This took me past the bench from behind, and when I got to it, he was there, sitting, facing east, facing the other entrance, the one I always came through. He hadn't seen me yet. I walked past the bench slowly, behind him, and came around to where I could see his face. And the moment I came into view from the east path, from his direction, he looked up. His eyes went right to the east entrance. He was waiting to see me come in from where I always came in. When he didn't see me there, he looked around. And then he saw me, standing 20 feet away from him, looking directly at him. I don't know what I expected. Embarrassment maybe, or some kind of innocent explanation. But he held my gaze for a moment with an expression I can only describe as completely flat. No emotion, no surprise, no apology. He just looked at me. And then he looked away, back toward the east entrance, as though I hadn't just caught him. I left the park immediately and called the police from my car. 2 officers came and spoke to me in the parking lot nearby. They took notes. They walked through the park, but the man was gone by then. One of the officers gently suggested that I might have misinterpreted innocent behavior, and I understand why he said that. There was no crime technically. A man sitting on a bench in a public park. But the other officer, a woman, pulled me aside quietly before they left and told me to trust my instincts. She told me to vary my routes, vary my times, and tell someone I trusted where I was every time I left the house. I stopped walking alone at night after that. I never saw that man again. But here is what I learned from this experience, and what I want you to hear clearly if you're someone who walks or runs alone at night. Human beings are very good at explaining away the things that make us uncomfortable. We label our own instincts as paranoia or unfairness. We don't want to assume the worst of strangers. We rationalize. We override the quiet alarm that our body is sending us because we don't want to be that person who overreacts. That quiet alarm exists for a reason. It has always existed for a reason. And the most dangerous thing you can do is silence it with logic. Story 3. It wasn't random. The last story I have for you tonight is the one that bothered me the most when I first read it. Not because of one dramatic moment, but because of the full picture, the details that only became clear at the very end. This is the story of a man I'll call Marcus. And the night Marcus realized that what was happening to him wasn't random at all. Marcus was 29, lived alone in a quiet suburb, and worked as a supervisor at a large logistics warehouse about 6 miles from his house. His shift ended at 11 on weeknights. He drove most of the time, but on nights where the weather was mild and he needed to decompress, he'd park his car at a lot near the edge of his neighborhood and walk the last mile and a half home. It was something he'd been doing occasionally for about a year. On a Friday night in early October, Marcus parked the car and started walking. He'd had a rough week. Long hours, short sleep, a difficult situation with a coworker he was dealing with. He had his hands in his pockets and his head down. He just wanted the cold air and the quiet walk to reset him before he got home. He was about halfway through his walk, on a wide residential street with older homes set back from the road, when he heard footsteps behind him. Now, Marcus told me that footsteps alone wouldn't have meant anything to him. It's a neighborhood. People walk. But these footsteps had a quality to them that caught his attention immediately. They were careful. They had that specific rhythm of someone trying to walk quietly, not someone strolling. Someone deliberately controlling the sound of their own movement. Marcus didn't turn around right away. He kept walking and shifted his attention to a dark car window he was passing, using the reflection to look back. There was a figure behind him. Not close, maybe 60 feet back. Walking. Marcus kept his pace steady and continued to use reflective surfaces where he could. Car windows, the glass front of a mailbox, a darkened storefront on the corner, to watch this figure. For 2 full blocks, the figure stayed with him. Same distance. Same careful, quiet pace. At the end of the second block, Marcus reached a corner and made a deliberate choice. He turned right, away from his home. He wanted to see if this person would follow him away from the direct route. The figure turned right. Marcus's mouth went dry. He turned right again at the next block, now heading in a rough circle that would eventually bring him back around. The figure followed him around the second turn. At this point, Marcus pulled out his phone and called his older brother, who lived about 20 minutes away. He told him quietly what was happening. His brother stayed on the line and told Marcus to try to get somewhere with people. Marcus explained that at 11:15 on a Friday night in a residential neighborhood, there wasn't anywhere obvious to go. Then Marcus did something that I found very telling when he described it to me. He started walking faster. Not running. Fast walking. The kind that's still technically a walk, but barely. And he told me that the figure behind him immediately matched his pace. Not running either. Just faster. Maintaining that same 60 feet of distance. That tells you something. That level of precision. Always maintaining the same gap. Always adjusting the moment Marcus adjusted. Is not something an ordinary person on a casual walk does instinctively. That is practiced. That is intentional. Marcus was now 2 blocks from home. He made the decision to go straight there rather than leading this person on a longer loop. His reasoning was that he wanted to be inside, behind a locked door, as fast as possible. His brother was already in the car and driving. He got to his house, got inside, locked the deadbolt and the chain. He turned off the downstairs lights and stood at his front window in the dark, looking out. The figure walked past his house slowly. Head turned toward Marcus's house as it passed, walking slowly enough to look, but keeping going, and then disappearing around the corner. Marcus's brother arrived 20 minutes later, and they both checked around the outside of the house with flashlights. Nothing. Nobody there. The police came, took a report, and drove around the block a few times without finding anyone. And then Marcus did something that cracked this whole thing open. Something he hadn't thought to do until about 2 days later when he had calmed down enough to think clearly. He went back and looked at his phone's location history. Because Marcus had a fitness app on his phone that tracked his routes and the times he walked them whenever location services were on. And he had been walking from that parking lot to his home several times over the past month. When he looked at his walk history, every single route was plotted and visible. The same general path with slight variations. The same neighborhood. The same time range, between 11 and midnight on weeknights. Marcus showed a trusted friend this data, and his friend asked a question that made Marcus go completely cold. He asked, if someone found your phone or had access to this data somehow, would they be able to predict where you'd be and when? Marcus didn't answer right away. He just stared at the screen. The app he used was connected to a social fitness platform. Like many of these apps, there's a feature that allows friends or connections to see your recent activity. Marcus wasn't sure exactly what his privacy settings were. He'd set the app up months ago and never thought about it again. When he checked, his recent routes were visible to anyone he was connected with on the platform. He had 41 connections on the app. Most of them he knew. Coworkers, gym contacts, a few people he hadn't spoken to in years. And one connection he didn't recognize at all. A profile with no photo and a username that meant nothing to him. He had no memory of accepting that connection. He reported this to police, gave them the profile information, and disconnected it immediately. He also changed every privacy setting on every fitness and social app he had. He never found out definitively who that profile belonged to, or how it got connected to him, or how long they had been watching his routes. But he also never parked in that lot again. Never walked that route again. And he told me that he now considers his location data, the data we all casually generate every single day without a second thought, one of the most dangerous things about living in the modern world. Because to the right person, your routine is a map. Your habits are a schedule. And most of us share that information freely without ever realizing we're doing it. Like and subscribe Might Night Experiences.
There's something about a church camp in the South that feels different from anywhere else on Earth. Maybe it's the way the trees grow so thick that sunlight barely reaches the ground. Maybe it's the heat, that heavy, suffocating summer heat that sits on your chest like something alive. Maybe it's the fact that you're miles from the nearest town, surrounded by kids who are supposed to feel safe, who are told they are safe, because what could possibly go wrong at church camp? You're with your youth group. You're with your counselors. You're with God. But the woods don't care about any of that. These are 3 stories from people who went to church camp somewhere in the American South. They went expecting worship songs and campfire devotionals and bad cafeteria food. What they got instead is something none of them have ever been able to fully explain. I'll be honest with you. I was never the kid who wanted to go to church camp. I grew up in a small town in rural Georgia, and every summer without fail, My parents signed me up for a week at the same Christian youth camp about 45 minutes outside of town. We're talking deep backwoods Georgia here. The kind of place where the roads stop having names and just become numbers. The kind of place where your cell phone signal disappears about 20 minutes before you actually arrive. I was 15 the summer this happened. Old enough to be annoyed about being there. Young enough that I didn't have any choice. The camp had been running for decades. It was the kind of place with a long history, old wooden cabins, a main chapel that smelled like pine and old hymnals, a lake for swimming, a dining hall where they served the same rotation of meals every single week. The counselors were mostly college kids from local Christian universities, 19 and 20 years old, trying to do something good with their summers. I've been going long enough that I knew the layout by heart. There were 8 sleeping cabins arranged in 2 rows of 4, all of them named after books of the Bible. There's a nature trail that looped around the back of the property through about a quarter mile of dense woods. And at the far end of that trail, partially hidden by overgrowth, was a 9th cabin that nobody used. We called it the Dead Cabin. The counselors never talked about it directly, but if you asked, they'd give you some vague answer about it being old and structurally unsound and off limits to campers, which of course made every single one of us want to go inside. The first 2 days of camp were normal. Worship sessions in the morning, activities in the afternoon, campfire devotionals at night. I was sharing a cabin with 7 other guys my age, including my best friend Marcus, who had been going to camp with me since we were 10. On the second night, one of the older campers, a 16-year-old named Drew who had a reputation for being the kind of kid who did whatever he wanted, told a group of us that he'd been inside the Dead Cabin the summer before. We were sitting outside our cabin after lights out, talking quietly so the counselors wouldn't hear us. Drew said he'd snuck out one night and gone all the way down the trail by himself with just a flashlight. He said the cabin door wasn't locked, just stuck from years of humidity warping the wood. He said he pushed it open and gone inside. He described what was inside pretty simply. A few old bunk beds with bare mattresses, shelves on the walls with old camp supplies, canteens, lanterns, rope, first aid kits that looked like they'd been there since the 1970s. He said it smelled bad, but not terrifying. More like mildew and old wood than anything else. But then he said something that made all of us go quiet. He said that on one of the bunk beds, there was a sleeping bag. And unlike everything else in that cabin, the sleeping bag didn't look old. It looked recent. It looked like someone had just been using it. Nobody said anything for a few seconds after that. Marcus tried to play it off and said Drew was making up to scare us. Drew shrugged and said he didn't care if we believed him or not. He'd seen it. I believed him. I didn't know why. I just did. On the 3rd night of camp, I couldn't sleep. This wasn't unusual for me at camp. The bunks were uncomfortable. The cabin was hot, even with the windows open. And there was always at least one kid snoring. I lay there for probably an hour just staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the woods outside. Crickets, the occasional frog, wind moving through the trees. And then something else. It was faint at first. Faint enough that I wasn't sure I was actually hearing it or just on the edge of sleep and imagining things. But the longer I lay there, the clearer it got. It sounded like someone singing. Not loud, not close, but out there in the woods somewhere in the direction of the trail that led to the Dead Cabin. There was a voice, low and slow. I couldn't make out words. It was more like a hum than actual singing. A melody I didn't recognize. I sat up in my bunk. Marcus was in the bunk across from me, and I could tell from his breathing that he was also awake. I whispered his name. He whispered back immediately. He'd heard it too. We both just sat there in the dark listening. It went on for maybe 2 or 3 more minutes. Then it stopped. Neither of us said anything. I lay back down and eventually fell asleep. And by morning, I had almost convinced myself it was a dream. Almost. The next day, I made a mistake. I mentioned what Marcus and I had heard to a couple of the other guys in our cabin. I kept my voice low, didn't make a big deal out of it. Just said we'd heard something weird in the middle of the night, some kind of singing coming from the woods. I should have kept my mouth shut, because by that afternoon, it had turned into a dare. Drew, of course, was the one who organized it. He said that after lights out, a group of us were going to walk the trail to the Dead Cabin and find out what was going on. He said it with the kind of casual confidence that made it hard to say no without looking scared. There were 5 of us who agreed to go. Me, Marcus, Drew, and 2 other guys from our cabin named Caleb and Seth. We waited until about midnight. The counselors did a check around 11, came through with flashlights, made sure everyone was in their bunks. After that, the camp went quiet. We waited another 30 minutes just to be safe. Then we slipped out. The trail was not fun to walk at night. There were no lights back there. We had 2 flashlights between the 5 of us, and we kept them pointed low so nobody from the main camp area could see us. The woods were loud the way southern woods always are at night. Insects screaming, things moving in the underbrush, but underneath all of that noise, the woods also felt very, very still. I don't know how to explain that better than that. Loud and still at the same time. Like the noise was a layer on top of something else that wasn't making any sound at all. Drew led the group. He'd walked the trail before. Marcus was right behind him, and I was right behind Marcus. Caleb and Seth were at the back, and I could hear them whispering to each other the whole way. We got about halfway down the trail when Drew held up his hand, and we all stopped. He turned off his flashlight. Then he pointed. Through the trees, about 50 yards ahead of us, there was a faint light coming from the direction of the dead cabin. Not a flashlight, not a phone screen, more like candlelight, warm and orange, and flickering very slightly. It was coming from inside the cabin, through what I assumed was a gap in the boarded-up window on the side of the structure. None of us moved for a solid 30 seconds. Then Drew started walking again. Slower now. No flashlight. I grabbed the back of Marcus's shirt so I didn't lose him in the dark. We got within maybe 20 feet of the cabin and stopped behind a cluster of trees. From there we could clearly see 2 things. 1, there was definitely light inside the cabin. 2, the cabin door was slightly open, maybe 4 or 5 inches. Not wide open, just cracked. Drew looked back at us. I could see his face in the reflected candlelight. He wasn't smiling anymore. Then we heard it, the same sound from the night before. That low, slow humming. A melody, tuneless almost, but not quite. Like an old and slowed down to half speed, coming from inside the cabin. Seth grabbed my arm from behind, and I nearly made a sound. Caleb was already backing up, and I couldn't blame him. Drew took one more step toward the cabin, and the humming stopped. The silence that followed was one of the most uncomfortable things I have ever experienced, because you could feel in it, and I know how that sounds, but you could genuinely feel that whatever was inside that cabin knew we were there. None of us said a word. Nobody moved. Then the door swung open. Not all the way, just a few more inches. Slowly, like someone pushing it from the inside. We ran. I don't have a better way to put it. All 5 of us just turned and ran back down that trail as fast as we could in the dark. Drew was the first one, and I was right behind him. Marcus and I sprinted side by side, and I didn't look back once. I don't think any of us did. We made it back to the cabin, got inside, and Drew shut the door behind us. We all just stood there in the dark breathing. After a while, Caleb said, and I'll never forget this, he said, "Did anyone see who it was?" None of us had. Pause. The next morning, I thought about telling one of the counselors, but I honestly didn't know what to say. That we'd snuck out at midnight and gone somewhere we weren't supposed to go, and we'd heard humming, that a door had opened. I could already hear how it sounded, so I didn't say anything. On the last day of camp, I did something I'm not proud of. I went to find the head counselor, a man named Brother Dale who had been running this camp for almost 20 years. I didn't tell him what I'd seen. I just asked him as casually as I could about the dead cabin. Why it was off limits? How long it had been closed? Brother Dale looked at me for a moment before answering. He said the cabin had been closed since 1987. He said there had been an incident involving a former camper. He wouldn't say what kind of incident, and that after that, the camp directors had decided to close it permanently. He said it wasn't safe structurally, which was the same answer we always got. I asked him if anyone ever went out there, if they ever had any trouble with trespassers or anything like that. He looked at me for another long moment. He said, "Son, nobody goes out there, not even me." Then he walked away. I've been back to that town a few times since. The camp is still running. I looked it up online once, and it still has a website, and you can still sign your kids up for a week in the summer. I don't know who was in that cabin. I don't know if they were dangerous. I don't know what would have happened if that door had opened all the way before we ran. I just know that whatever was in there didn't want to be found. And I think about it, Every time I hear someone humming a song I don't recognize.
This is something I've told very few people because it involves someone I actually knew. And to this day, I don't have an explanation that makes complete sense. I'm from a small town in Mississippi. Grew up going to a Baptist church that ran a summer camp every July for the youth group. The camp was about an hour's drive into the hill country, on a property that the church had owned for decades. It was beautiful in that raw, overgrown way that a lot of land looks when people maintain it just barely enough to keep it functional. I was 14 when this happened. The counselor for my group that summer was a 20-year-old named Travis. Travis was the kind of guy that every 14-year-old wants their counselor to be. He was funny. He was relaxed. He didn't enforce lights out too strictly. He'd stay up late playing cards with us and talking about anything and everything. He'd been a camper himself growing up, and the way he talked about this place, you could tell he genuinely loved it. The first 3 days of camp were completely normal. Everything fine. Everything good. Travis was upbeat and energetic, and every morning he'd lead us in these terrible dad joke devotionals that we all groaned at and secretly loved. On the fourth night, something changed. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. No idea what time. I didn't have a watch, and I noticed immediately that Travis's bunk was empty. This wasn't alarming on its own. Counselors got up in the night sometimes. Bathroom, whatever. I wasn't concerned. I rolled over and went back to sleep. But when I woke up again closer to morning, his bunk was still empty. He was back by breakfast, looking completely normal. Ate his food, made his jokes, led the morning session without anything seeming off. I had a bunkmate named Jared who had also noticed Travis was gone, and Jared was the type who couldn't let things go. At lunch, he straight up asked Travis where he'd been the night before. Travis smiled and said he'd had trouble sleeping and went for a walk. He said it simply and casually, no hesitation, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Jared nodded. I nodded. That was the end of it. Except the next night, Travis's bunk was empty again. Now I want to be fair here. Adults go for walks. Counselors have stress. There is nothing inherently wrong with a 20-year-old going outside at night for some air. I understood that even at 14, so I told myself it was nothing. What made it impossible to keep telling myself that happened on the sixth night, the second to last night of camp. I woke up again. Travis was gone again. But this time, I don't know why, I sat up instead of going back to sleep. Maybe I was just restless. Maybe something felt different. I'm not sure. I sat there in the dark for maybe 10 minutes. And then I heard footsteps on the wooden porch outside the cabin. Slow. Deliberate. The door opened. Travis came in. He closed the door quietly behind him. He didn't turn on any lights. He just stood there for a moment in the dark doorway. And then he turned around and looked directly at me. Now here's what I need you to understand. It was dark. The only light was from whatever moonlight was coming through the small window above my bunk. I could not see his face clearly. I want to be transparent about that. But I could see enough. His expression was wrong. The only way I know how to describe it is this. It wasn't Travis's face. I mean, physically it was. Same guy, same features. But the expression on it was something I had never seen on him in 6 days of being around him constantly. It wasn't calm. It wasn't tired. It wasn't amused. Completely and utterly blank. Like looking at a photograph of a person instead of the person themselves. He looked at me for what felt like a very long time. Then he walked to his bunk, lay down, and pulled the sheet over himself. I did not sleep for the rest of that night. Pause. The next morning, Travis was normal again. Completely normal. Breakfast, joking around, last day of camp wrap-up. He hugged kids goodbye when their parents came to pick them up. He shook hands with the other counselors. When my mom came to get me, Travis introduced himself, told her I'd been a great camper, shook my hand. And when he shook my hand, I looked at his face. Normal. Completely normal. Warm eyes, easy smile, the Travis I'd spent a week with. I've thought about this so many times over the years. What was he doing out there at night? Why did he look at me that way? Was I half asleep and imagining things? I've never been able to answer any of those questions. A few years later, I heard through some people from my old church that Travis had gone on to become a youth minister somewhere in Alabama. By all accounts, he's a good one. People love him. And maybe I imagined the whole thing. But I've never fully been able to convince myself of that. I'll keep the details of where this was vague because I still know people from this camp, and I don't want to cause any problems for anyone. What I'll say is that it was a non-denominational Christian camp in the Appalachian foothills of North Carolina. It ran every summer for about 2 weeks in late June. I was 16 when this happened, which means I had enough sense to be scared by it, but not enough sense to tell a single adult. The camp property was gorgeous. Mountains in the background, a river running along the east edge of the property, tall old hardwood trees everywhere. The main chapel was a big open-sided structure built on a hill at the center of camp. Wooden beams, a rusted metal roof, rough-cut pews that had been there longer than anyone could remember. Behind the chapel, maybe 30 or 40 yards into the tree line, the land started to slope downward sharply. There was no trail back there. No reason to go back there. The camp directors had told us at the very start of camp, on day 1, during orientation, that the area behind the chapel was strictly off-limits. They said it was because the slope was unstable and there had been erosion issues and they didn't want anyone getting hurt. That was a reasonable explanation. I had no reason to doubt it. Then I met a girl named Paige. Paige was from a different youth group than mine, from somewhere in South Carolina. She was 17, confident in a quiet way, and she'd been coming to this camp since she was 12. On the second evening, a group of us were sitting by the river after dinner, and she brought up the area behind the chapel completely out of nowhere. She said she'd asked one of the older camp directors about it the previous summer and gotten the same answer everyone got. Erosion, unstable ground, stay away. But then she said she'd gone back there anyway. We all looked at her. She said she'd gone on the last day of camp the summer before, in broad daylight, because she was tired of rules with no real explanations. She said she'd climbed down the slope carefully, holding on to trees and branches, and at the bottom she'd found something. A clearing. A small, flat clearing at the base of the slope, surrounded on all sides by dense trees. And in the middle of the clearing, arranged in a rough circle, were 12 wooden stakes driven into the ground. Not tall, maybe a foot each, maybe 18 inches. Rough-cut wood, not painted or decorated in any way. But tied to each stake with old rope was a small bundle of some kind. She couldn't identify exactly what was in the bundles. She said they looked like cloth wrapped around something and tied off at the top. Some of them had come partially unwrapped over what was apparently a long time. And from one of them she could see what looked like old dried plant material. She hadn't touched any of them, but she'd looked at them for a minute, then climbed back up the slope and didn't go back. I will be honest, when Paige finished telling this story, my first thought was that this was some kind of old folk practice. Something from the deep history of that particular area of Appalachia that had nothing to do with the camp specifically. The camp had presumably been built on land that existed long before it was a camp. Whatever was in that clearing could have been from decades ago, maybe longer. That was the rational explanation, and I held on to it. What made it harder to hold on to was what happened 4 nights later. Our cabins were on the west side of the property. From my cabin, you couldn't see the chapel directly. There were trees between us and the hill it sat on, but you could see the glow of the camp lights reflecting off the metal roof on clear nights. I was lying in my bunk around 2 in the morning, completely awake for no good reason, looking at the ceiling. My cabin was quiet. Everyone else was asleep. Then I heard it. Voices. Not close. Not in the cabin or immediately outside it. Further away, in the direction of the chapel. Low, overlapping voices, like a group of people talking all at once, but too far away to make out any words. I sat up and looked out the window. From where I was, I could see the roof of the chapel through the trees. And at the base of the hill just below the chapel, I could see lights. Small lights. Moving slowly. I counted them as best I could. 12. They moved in what looked like a loose circle below the chapel, right at the tree line, right at the point where the slope began. Not flashlights. The light was too warm for that. More like flames. Small flames. The voices went on for maybe 2 minutes. Then the lights went out, and everything was dark and quiet again. I lay back down and stared at the ceiling for a long time. In the morning I found Paige at breakfast and told her what I'd seen. She put her fork down and looked at me. She asked how many lights. I told her 12. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Same as the stakes." We debated whether to tell anyone. We decided not to, for reasons that are hard to explain now as an adult. I think we were afraid of not being believed. Or afraid that we'd be the ones who got in trouble for being awake at 2 in the morning and looking out windows. We spent the rest of camp being very careful. We stuck to group activities. We didn't go anywhere alone. We never saw anything else that wasn't completely normal. On the last day, when my parents came to get me, I loaded my bag into the car and looked back at the camp one more time. At the chapel on the hill. At the tree line behind it. I never went back to that camp. I want to be clear about something. I'm not saying what I saw was supernatural. I'm not saying it was a cult or anything like that. There are explanations that don't require anything paranormal. The lights could have been campers who'd also snuck out. The voices could have been anything. But 12 lights. Same as 12 stakes. And whoever arranged those stakes in that clearing had done it long enough ago that they were old and rotting and partially fallen apart. Which means people had been going down that slope for a very long time before I ever arrived. And the camp directors had always told everyone to stay away.